In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to build our first BIS job. So we're going to keep this really pretty straightforward and basic. We just want to take a simple file, a CSV file, and we want to load it into a SQL Server table. So no matter which database type you're working with, it's all pretty much the same unless you start getting into the bulk loaders and things like that, which we'll talk about in future trainings. But in this particular training, we're just going to take this CSV file and we're going to load it into this table. Okay, and it's a very simple table. If you look at it, it's just a date, a couple of IDs, and some dollar amounts, and some attributes like sold units and stuff. So we're going to keep this really straightforward. Okay. All right. So the first thing I want to do is go into BlueSky Integration Studio, and I want to create a brand new job. So I'm going to say new ETL job. Okay. And then I want to load a text file into SQL Server. So what I need to do is pull over my text file object, and then I need to pull over a SQL Server object. Okay. And in between that, I need a transformation object. Okay. So this is where the data flows through to be transformed and to be mapped at the field level. And then it's output to the SQL Server table. Okay. So then I'm going to come up here and I'm going to turn on my connector. That's a toggle button. So I click it to turn it on, and then after I use it, you'll notice it automatically turns off. So I'm going to click that again, and I'm going to drag and drop from my transform to my output object. So all I'm doing here is I'm just kind of defining the flow of the data. I'm saying I want to load this text file through this transformation into the SQL Server table. Okay. Now, if I double click on the text object, I get this window here. Okay. Now, I don't want to have to type in all of these, column layout attributes. I mean, that's just time consuming and a lot of work. And I don't really have to, because on the left here, I have all sorts of wizards to use that will help me kind of read that data in, so I don't have to type as much. Okay. But basically what I'm doing here is I'm defining the text file. What does this text file look like? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click on the text file wizard, and I'm going to pick the file that I want to load, which is that file that we had out there, and that's in my BlueSky training folder, my BIS training, and then this is the transactions, that CSV file that I had pointing to earlier. And I know that this is a first row, it has first row column headers. It's a comma separated file. I could choose whether it's DOS or Unix end of line markers. I could say that it's a delimited file, so it's delimited by comma. If, for instance, your data is wrapped in strings, you could say, you could check this box here and say my strings are wrapped in, say, double quotes or single quotes. Okay. So basically, this is it, though. I mean, I got first row column headers. It's a DOS file, and it's a comma separated file. So now that I have that kind of specified, I want to basically just say load me a sample. All that does is it goes out and it reads the first 500 rows of the text file, and it verifies that my settings are correct, that I can correctly read that file, and that it's parsing it correctly based on the information that I gave it. Okay. The other thing that it's doing is, you'll notice this says best guess layout on the first 500 rows. Okay. So what that's doing is because this is a text file and there is no schema per se, it has to guess the sizes of the fields for you. And it does it based on the first 500 rows. Okay. So that may or may not be right. It can get you close, but you probably have to tweak it a little bit on text files. Okay. But it gets you a good starting point. So I'm going to say OK. And you'll notice that it automatically fills in my column layout for me. I don't have to go in and type all this information in and specify all my data types and field sizes. It pretty much figured that out for me. Okay. Now, because it's a text file and it did a best guess, I might have to tweak it a little bit. Okay, so for calendar date, for instance, I might want to come in here and say, you know what, this is a date time, not a string. And I might want to say down here that these integers look awfully small, and that's because on the first 500 rows, the max it found was 2, right, or a length of 2. But I might want to come in here and just say, you know what, these are 10s. Okay. You're just kind of increasing the sizes a little bit. And then here, the biggest one it found was 6.4. Maybe I'll make that like a 15.4, and then maybe I'll make the sold units a 10. So I'm just kind of tweaking it a little bit. Okay, so I'll say OK. Now my text file is defined, basically. So if I right-click on the text object to get to the properties, I can right-click and say Properties. That'll bring up the Properties box where I can see all the individual properties. You'll notice that a lot of these are filled in because we just walked through that wizard, and that wizard transferred those values that you picked in there in the wizard into this all the properties here. So it knows it's a comma separated, it's first row column headers is true, here's the file I want to load, it's DOS, so all those properties came over with it. And now if I want, I can kind of give it a name, a meaningful name. So I'll just call this my sales file. Okay. Now on the other side, I need to define the SQL Server connection so that I can connect to the table. Here I can do this a couple of different ways. If you double click on it, you'll come to this, and you can click on the database wizard. Or if you happen to be in the properties, you can click on column layout here and then the ellipse, and that will bring you to the same exact window. Okay, so there's a couple different ways to get to this window here. You can either double click on the icon, or if you happen to be in the properties box, you can just simply click on that ellipse right there under column layout, and it'll bring you right to the column layout window. Okay, so this is a database, not a text file, so I want to go ahead and click on my database wizard, and this is going to walk me through a wizard that will allow me to connect to my SQL Server database. And you notice here the first thing it's going to ask me is, what type of database do you want to connect to? And it knows my object is SQL Server, so it defaults it to there for me. Okay, but I got all these different database types that I can connect through. For SQL Server, it says, do you use integrated security? I don't particularly use that, so I'll say no. And then I'll put in my server information for my SQL Server. Alright, I am working out of a catalog called BIS Training. Okay, and that's it. So I'm just basically saying, here's my SQL Server, here's my username, password, and this is the catalog that I'm working in. If I want, I can save this to my favorites. So I can add this and say, OK here. And now, next time I come into this window for any other biz job, I just have to click on favorites and select that guy right there, and it'll auto-fill all that in for me. So I don't have to remember my passwords or type that in every time. So I'm going to say next, and it's going to basically bring up the list of tables in my database. Okay, so you'll notice for SQL Server, it's going to include all the system tables and all that kind of stuff. I can just kind of scroll down here and find my table. Oh, there it is. So I want to load my data into a table called Transactions Table that I created. And you'll notice that was the one that I had brought up here. I created this table called Transactions Table. Okay. So I'll pick that. And what that's going to do is it's going to go out and reverse engineer the schema of that table and just bring it into the BlueSky Integration Studio. And it's going to say, hey, you just walked through the wizard. Would you like to update the connection properties that you just used in the import wizard? Yeah, absolutely. Why not? So I'm going to say OK there. And you'll notice I've got all my information here as far as data types and sizes and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so I'm going to say OK. And you'll notice because I walked through that wizard again, all of my properties are filled out here. I got my table name and my server and my username, passwords, and all that kind of stuff automatically filled in for me. So you can do all this by hand through the properties if you want, but it's so much nicer, quicker to go through the wizard. So on the name, I'm just going to call this transactions table. Okay, just to give it a meaningful name. Okay, and then the other thing I need to point out is the aliases. Okay, so if you look at each object here, you got the sales file, and you got the transaction table, and the transformation, and you'll notice it's that the aliases for each one of those start with like A1, A2, A3, and those are just the defaults. I can rename those if I'd like. But what that is the unique identifier that uniquely identifies that object on the screen. Okay, and it's mostly going to be used for when you're writing transformation code or something like that. That's how you're going to reference that object in code. Okay, so I could name this I1 for input 1, or I could name it sales file to match my description. So let's kind of go with that scenario here. Let's just say we'll call this one transactions table. Okay. I like to name mine, I1, I2 for input 1, input 2, that kind of thing, just because it keeps them short, but you can go any way you want. Okay, so now we have some meaningful naming attached to our objects. Now the hard part of the process is I need to go in and map those fields, field by field, over to from the source to the destination. Okay, so here's my source on the left here. These are my source fields, and my destination fields are here, and I need to map them one for one over to here. So I can tell it, this is where I want you to load that data. So I can do this by drag and drop, or I can just simply pick the field up and drag it and drop it over, like so. Oops. Okay. Or I can pick multiples and drag and drop those over. Or I can say automatic mapping. So what that'll do is it'll automatically map the fields where it finds a matching field name. So if I click that, say yes, you'll notice that it matched almost all of them, except this one over here is called calendar_date, or date is spelled out, and this one is calendar_DT. So that didn't match perfectly. So this one I can just simply pick up and drag and drop over. Okay. Now, if I needed to do any sort of translation to this, or cleanup, or I needed to write any code, all that's behind in the code behind window for at the field level. So you'll notice if I hover over or click on any of these, I get this box here next to each field level here. And I can click on that box, and I get the code behind window. Now I can write any kind of Visual Basic.NET code necessary to transform that data any way that I want. So, I'll just write some sample stuff here, but you'll notice that we have IntelliSense built in. I'll say S equals, and we have all kinds of stuff built in with help that pops up that tells you how to use the functions and what the parameters are and all that kind of stuff. So it's it's a nice syntax editor built in with the entire .NET language that you can use to transform your data. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK here. We're going to keep this job simple. So I just map my fields over. I say OK. And that's it. So I defined my input, I defined my output, and I mapped my data. Now I just want to hit the compile button, and it's going to say, hey, do you want to save your changes? I'll say yes. And we'll call this, let's see, we'll call this load transactions. Say OK. So now it's going to go through its compilation process. You'll notice here it goes through a validation and says job validations complete and no errors or warnings were found. That means we did everything correctly and there weren't any errors found. So now I can say compile. And what that does is it compiles the job to an executable. So it actually physically writes the code to make this job work, and then compiles it to an exe, and then it stores it in the enterprise server. And you'll notice here if I come over to job control, here's my load transactions job out on the server now. So this whole designer window here is nothing more than a window into the BIS enterprise server. Okay, so everything I'm doing here is everything is stored and saved at the server level. Okay, nothing is stored locally on my machine. Okay, so now if I want, I'll kind of go back. I think we missed one step, so I think I'm going to go back here and say go to Properties. And one thing that I wanted to point out here was, by default, when you load data, okay, so I'm loading a text through the transformation into this destination here, the action property specifies how that data gets loaded. Okay, so basically I can do all kinds of things here related to what type of action and how that data gets loaded. I could say first clear the table, then insert the records, or just insert only, which would effectively be an append. It would append the data, or an update, or I can do update insert new, or I can do delete on a key match. So that would say, wherever you find a match, delete that record in the transactions table. So in this case, I'm going to say clear then insert, because I might want to run this job multiple times, or maybe I'm treating it like a staging table. I just want to clear the table out every time, and I want to reload it from scratch. So I'm going to go ahead and say clear then insert. And you'll notice here, whenever I make a change to the job, I want to hit the compile button again, okay? Because that change will not take effect until I recompile the program. It's just like any other program that you'd write as a developer or a program. Is when you make code changes to that program, you have to recompile it, right? So that's exactly what we did here. I just recompiled the job. And now I'm going to come over here into the job control, okay? And I can right click on that job and say run. Okay? And I can monitor that job as it's running. Okay, so it's probably going to run very, very fast. It's already finished. So basically what this is telling me, this is the monitoring window. And what this is saying is that the job is finished. Okay, so I didn't error out. It actually finished. I loaded 16,000 records into the table. So I have two lines here. One is my sales file and one is my transaction table, and that matches my objects here. Sales file, transaction table. Okay. And what that's telling me is I read 16,000 records and I wrote 16,000 records. Okay, and it took about 1 second. And it loaded at almost 1 million rows per minute, or 16,000. Basically it loaded all the data within a second. So it says it loaded 16,000 records per second. Okay. I can also look at the log for that job. So I can come in here and say, oh, okay, let me see some of the things that happened here. Okay, so I can review the log. Okay, and that's it. We just built our very first BIS job. So in the next cycle, we're going to look at a couple other things. We're going to actually create an error in this job, and we're going to do some things, to kind of get you deeper involved in how to manage the job, and we're also going to get into parameters as well. Okay, so we'll see you in the next one.